Okay, I think everybody in the lobby is now in. Welcome everyone to our second post-public consultation webinar on the Draft Australian Dangerous Goods Code Review. Your presenters for today are me, Deborah Kirk, and my colleague Matt Arkell. The purpose of today's session is to provide our second progress update on how we're addressing the comments received during public consultation on the Consultation Regulatory Impact Statement and the draft code. Before we get too far into the session, I have some important housekeeping matters to address. Firstly, this meeting is being recorded. A copy of the recording will be made available on the NTC website, probably early next week. As we're all participating from many different locations today, I'd like to make a general acknowledgement of traditional owners. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands upon which we are meeting. I pay my respects to their various elders, past and present, and to any of the elders of other communities who may be here today. Okay. Next, please, Matt. Okay. So for today, what we're going to cover is we'll do a very brief overview of the comments that we received. We'll provide the next progress of the issues identified during public consultation, the likely outcomes for some of these matters, and the process as we continue to move forward. Thanks, Matt. There we go. Just to recap from our last webinar, we received around 66 submissions during the public consultation. Many of these were from industry associations on behalf of their members. Overall, the submissions were very supportive, particularly with regard to the new structure of the code. The comments received were for the most part about specific details or discrete issues. Matt, your turn.
Okay, so we're going to quickly run through a few slides that you will have already seen if you've seen the previous webinar. So if you haven't and you need more detail on these, either just check that webinar or get in touch with us. So a couple of provisions that are not being carried forward, the exemptions for short journeys, and the use of partitions for segregation. So neither of these provisions were supported, and we're not going to be taking them into the new code. We've decided that the best approach for segregation was to drop the partition requirement, and we also didn't hear any support for the extremely short journeys exemption, so that's not being carried forward. As far as DGSAs go, Dangerous Goods Safety Advisors, we heard support for the implementation of those, but also some concerns about how to assess those assess a DGSA as competent. So for now, we're going to be retaining it as a recommendation, which should support industry to think about how to begin the upskilling process. As you may be aware, coming up behind the code review is quite a bit of work on training, and we'll be recommending that the DGSA requirement is included in that work. We'll look to make this a mandatory requirement in the future. And on the question of regulation of diesel, we're working towards an interim solution for the code that will generally keep the status quo as it currently is. There will be additional work on the regulation of diesel, but that's to ensure that we properly calibrate the appropriate level of regulation that balances safety and productivity in the transport of diesel. And as we've mentioned previously, we are not looking to regulate petrol and diesel in the same manner, but to come up with an appropriate set of regulations for diesel. Some key changes that are continuing to be pursued. So these are two key changes that were widely supported by industry and some regulators, but opposed by some other regulators and emergency services. And in most instances where a regulator hasn't supported these changes, they've deferred to emergency services. The NTC considers these reforms to be needed, and we're going to continue to pursue them. Okay, so the first of these is respirators. The draft provisions are being rewritten to clarify the minimum specifications for respirators. As you can see from the slide, the idea is that it's a quick donning hood with an appropriate level of respiratory protection. The other reform is the removal of EIPs on IBCs. We're going to be continuing to work on that, and these, as with other things, these were discussed in greater detail in webinar 1. Back to you, Deborah.
Thanks. So some of the key issues that we're still working through are on this slide. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can see them there and you can view them in the recording of the webinar. Some of these have already had summary drafting. You'll be able to see the progress for some of them on the updated spreadsheet that will be published with the recording of the webinar. Most of these really just require simple minor redrafts to ensure that the proper application of them. Okay. A quick reminder of what we covered in webinar 1. If you didn't have a chance to join the webinar live, as said, you can view the recording on our project page on the NTSC website. But just briefly, during the last webinar, we discussed the DG code, the relationship between the DG code and the model legislation. We spoke about the changes in terminology, particularly transport, transporter, carrier. So, but as I said, they're all outlined in that last webinar. We also had a look at the correction of a major omission from the transport of empty unclaimed storage tanks and some minor redrafting of provisions for environmentally hazardous substances and exemptions for retail consumers. This redrafting was to remove any ambiguity from those. We also touched briefly on small loads and on segregation. Today, we're going to take a deeper look at these two topics. The spreadsheet, which I just mentioned, details the drafting changes in response to comments in public submissions and other identified issues. You can see what we've got is the provision number, what the comment was we received, whether or not we had any suggested changes. In some instances, people identified an issue, but then also suggested the change. And then the final column is what we've done to address it. A copy of this was published with the recording of webinar 1, and we'll publish an updated copy will be published early next week with the recording of this webinar. As with the previous version, some rows will be shaded grey. This indicates that those provisions have already been redrafted to address the comments received. The unshaded rows are those we're still working on. In some instances, there will be comments within that column, even though we haven't fully addressed them, but you'll be able to see where our thinking is going. The next section of this webinar covers proposed resolutions for some provisions and also takes a more in-depth look at small loads and at segregation and mixed loading. We'd love to hear your feedback on whether or not we've got these right. As we go through them, you can give your feedback by posting your thoughts in the chat, or you can email us after the session. Back to you, Matt.
Okay, the personal use and business use provisions. So we heard some concerns about the potential for misuse of these provisions by transporters. One of the advantages of the way that we've reconfigured these provisions is that they actually distinguish quite clearly between personal transport for domestic or leisure use and transport by an enterprise for their use. So if you're familiar with the current code and regulations, those provisions overlap to quite a significant degree, and it can be difficult to disentangle them. So some of the changes that we've made, we heard some concerns about a lack of quantity restrictions, and we also heard some concerns about the potential for IBCs to be used. So one of the things that we've done is that in no case can an amount be transported that would require placarding. We've also included capacity limits. So there's a 30-litre quantity limit for personal use, which aligns to the that's a standard sort of exemption threshold elsewhere in the code, similar for what's been proposed for environmentally hazardous substances. And it's quite reasonable to argue that if you're transporting in packages bigger than that, then it's not for retail sale or for domestic or domestic-like situations. We've also kept the 450 litre limit for enterprise transport. One of the things that we've done here is we've retained the requirement that this does not apply to transporting DG for supply or for distribution. So those activities fall under the carriage of dangerous goods, and they're subject to regulation under the code. In most cases, when you're transporting these sort of quantities, the main control that you need is a transport document and making sure that the goods are properly packaged. So until you get out of the small loads threshold and you're then putting placards on a vehicle and you're putting all of those other controls in place, then that's a completely different situation. And a final note, we are making clear that if you're transporting as a tradesperson, that you fall under the enterprise provisions. The way that enterprise is defined in the new code should make this reasonably clear, but we want to make it even clearer at the location where these provisions are, that it's not personal use if you're transporting it as a tool of trade. Just to quickly run through, enterprise is defined in the draft definitions as it's any natural person, any legal person, whether profit making or not, any association or group of persons without legal personality, and it goes on that essentially excludes that. The other thing that we're working through is ensuring that there are restrictions on the transport of Class 1, except for low hazard explosives that are transported in accordance with relevant exemptions. There'll be a bit of work on the Class 1 side of things to make sure that that's all properly tied together and doesn't cause any untoward outcomes. The other area that we are looking at is questions around dangerous situation and incidents. So we heard some concerns that there was misalignment between the draft code's definition for dangerous situation and the current definition. The main way that we've addressed this is we've brought the existing definition from the regulation into the code. Of course, it will have to be subject to drafting as we get through the drafting process, but for now it's the existing definition. The other thing that we heard was that the draft definition is lengthy and could be difficult for duty holders to interpret. One of the concerns we have about the existing definition is that it's actually quite ambiguous. It talks about there being an imminent risk of serious injury, and significant harm, and those terms aren't defined at all. So what we're proposing to do in response to that is we're reconfiguring this provision to ensure that detailed information acts as guidance. So on the next slide, I've got the first part of this. So as you can see, we've broken it up into subsections. In 18511, you'll find the definition of a dangerous situation that exists in the current regulation, so it's no different to what it is at present. And then we've expanded, we've taken those different categorizations of what an incident might be, and have kept those broken out. And we've said, if you meet one of these situations, then it's a dangerous situation. That doesn't mean that something that doesn't meet those doesn't also meet the definition. It's a little bit, I appreciate it's a little bit complicated, but what we want to be clear about is that if you fall into one of these, you absolutely fall into the definition. So what you can see, if we look at these, we've got your requiring medical treatment and those sorts of things, and we've also got the loss of product provisions. So these are quite similar to what you'll find in the New South Wales EPA's Transport Emergency Response Plan guidance, that essentially if you spill or are likely to spill a quantity equivalent to a placard load, then you are in the realm of a dangerous situation. Of course, one of the real challenges here It's not possible to draw definitive lines covering every situation, but we are reasonably confident that the current approach hasn't succeeded to the extent that we would like, and we feel that this solution provides industry and regulators with a bit more confidence that when serious incidents happen in transport, that they're reported to the authorities, and that will ultimately support better data gathering and enable us all to learn about these incidents and what we can do to prevent them. So we've included a note there that that references something else that the New South Wales EPA guidance was quite clear on, that you should be reporting incidents when they occur. It's best if you don't get into arguments about whether an incident was reportable or not. There's no offence for reporting an incident when it wasn't a reportable incident, and it helps everybody to learn. So I know we've covered small loads previously, but this is quite foundational to the transport of dangerous goods, and it's quite a common question. So we wanted to run through this again. Just a reminder that the small loads provision replaces the concept of less than a placard load in the current code. And what we've done is we've consolidated all of those concessions that currently apply to less than a placard load into a single location in the code. The situation is quite similar to the current system. There's a couple of minor tweaks around organic peroxides and self-reactive substances, and making sure that everything is in one place. So there's a note there that we're thinking about how to treat loads that include low hazard explosives or 1.4S explosives appropriately, similar to the current arrangements, and making sure that they're properly incorporated. But that will be more of work for when we get to the Class 1 stuff. The thresholds are fundamentally quite similar to the present situation, where if you're transporting infectious substances, the thresholds are very low. If you're transporting toxics and toxic gases or flammable gases or packing group 1 substances, then you've got a threshold of 250 litres or kilos. And then if you're transporting other dangerous goods, then the threshold is 1,000. And much like at present, you take the DG that has the lowest threshold, and if you've got less DG than that on the transport unit, then the small load provisions are accessible to you. Just to reiterate, these are concessions that aren't mandatory, but it will be useful to use it in most cases. I expect that most people will use them. That just clarifies that that if you go from 1,010 litres on a vehicle down to 990 litres on a vehicle, you're not obliged to remove the placards. One of the things that these provisions do make clear, though, is that if your vehicle is placarded, the small load concession is not available to you. You need to follow all of the rules for a fully regulated load of dangerous goods. And importantly, all the concessions that you can take are all found in one place. They refer out to the relevant sections of the code, no digging around in the code and the regulations to find out what does and doesn't apply. The other relatively minor change, it's more of a change in language than anything, is that we're differentiating between aggregate quantity and other uses of total quantity or similar terminology. Aggregate quantity refers to the amount of dangerous goods in the load as a whole. Where we're adding up dangerous goods quantities elsewhere in the code, they use the term total quantity. One of the things that we've done is we've more tightly defined the definition of aggregate quantity for liquids. At present, you can use liquid. You can measure liquids in either litres or kilograms, and we are changing that. We're following the model of ADR that liquids are measured in litres. The other thing that we've done, which is mainly to address a concern or question that gets raised quite a bit, is the question of adding together kilograms and litres. Aggregate quantity does not have units, just to confuse everybody, but we've added a note into the code that makes it clear that you can add together kilograms and litres in determining aggregate quantity for the load. Another comment we heard was that we could consider renaming the unlimited category to something like always a small load or something similar to that. We gave some thought to it. One misinterpretation that we considered is that that could be perceived as meaning that when there's any amount of those substances, then the load is always a small load. That's probably a low likelihood, but we want to be reasonably cautious about that. The other thing is that there's a table note that explains this. We're doing a bit of work to make sure that the draft of the code is quite clear about how to treat substances that are such as UN 3077 and 3082 environmentally hazardous substances, that they're treated appropriately and that everybody's clear on what the rules are. And similar to the earlier part about those two exemptions, we're giving some thought to how to address the transport of low hazard explosives or explosives that meet explosives category 1 loads along with other dangerous goods, and do that in a comprehensive fashion. And that's another thing that we'll explore with the advisory group for explosives. And finally, this is probably more about detailed work that's yet to come, is the question of tanks and vehicles and what we're doing there. So there's a bit of tidying up to be done in preparation for that. We are working on clarifying how tank and vehicle approvals work together. There were some concerns about vehicles being approved without their containment system, and that's not the intent of this. Being clearer that hybrid designs between AS2809 style tanks or ADR style tanks, that's not by any stretch the intent of the new code. Making sure that we have clear provisions that relate to towing vehicles that are not also approved, such as prime movers, and making sure that all of the linkages between the different provisions are properly defined, because the administrative controls are found in part 1, and then the requirements for design of tanks are in part 6, and the vehicles are in part 9, and just making sure that everything is properly connected between those. And that will ultimately allow us to work with with people who are closely interested in tanks and vehicles to wrap all this up and make sure that we've got a nice comprehensive set of provisions that do what we need it to do. Back to you, Deborah.
Thanks, Matt. While I go through load restraint, there's a bit of chat on the small load, not the small loads, on the exemptions. You might like to just have a look at those. I've answered some in there, but if you have a look, and after load restraint, we can stop and discuss that if you like with the group. Okay. With load restraint, we received a number of comments on the proposal to remove the detailed general load restraint requirements and refer instead to the performance standards for vehicles. Many of those comments recommended referring to the load restraint guide rather than the performance standards. I think it's important to understand the relationship between the load restraint requirements in the heavy vehicle mass dimension and loading national regulations. I'm just going to say heavy vehicle regulations and the load restraint guide. The heavy vehicle regulations set minimum requirements for load restraint. These are designed to ensure that the load remains on the vehicle and doesn't move in such a way as to affect the vehicle's stability. They have nothing to do with the type of freight that's on there. These requirements are set out as performance standards. You can find the performance standards in Schedule 7 of those regulations or replicated on page 4 of the load restraint guide. Load restraint requirements for light vehicles are identical to those for the heavy vehicles. The guides in the load restraint guide have been developed by engineers to meet the performance standards. While the guides cover many loading scenarios, they're not exhaustive. There may not be a published guide for your specific circumstances, in which case you should use the tables in the back of the load restraint guide to work out an appropriate restraint method. The guides are also not mandatory. Provided you meet the performance standards in the regulations, you can use a different restraint method. For this reason, it's important that the code references the performance standards rather than the load restraint guide. Requirements for load restraint are well established and legislated. They apply to all vehicles and all loads, not just dangerous goods. It's no longer necessary or appropriate to include specific load restraint methods in the code. Retaining these requirements in the code results in duplication of the laws and has the potential for conflicts or contradictions to develop over time. The other comments we received were primarily around the higher risk posed by dangerous goods compared to other freight. The specific load restraint requirements in section 7.5.7 of the draft code address this risk. We recognise that load restraint performance standards are designed to ensure the load remains on the vehicle and doesn't move in such a way as to affect the vehicle's stability. These performance standards, as I said earlier, are not focused on the freight being carried or protecting it from damage. The detailed requirements in the draft code are additional to those performance standards and are specifically focused on protection of the dangerous goods. They're designed to protect the dangerous goods from damage, ensure the dangerous goods packages can't change orientation, and ensure that they're not stacked unless they're actually designed for stacking. We feel the requirements as drafted provide an appropriate separation of load restraint requirements applicable to all loads and those necessary to address the specific risks when the load contains dangerous goods. We're proposing to leave the provisions in section 7.5.7 as drafted in the public consultation version of the code. Before we move on, I wanted to touch on gates. We've had a couple of comments about that gates are well established by the industry, that many will want to continue to use gates, and that's fine. We've removed the mandatory use of gates, but there's nothing stopping anyone from using gates as part of an overall load restraint system that meets the performance standards. And this is a really important part. What we have found in the past is because of the use of gates, there has not been a really full understanding of that gates are just part of a load restraint system. Your load still has to be stopped from moving to destabilise the vehicle. The gates will keep it on the vehicle, but it won't stop them moving. So you still have to either block or direct restrain them. So as I said, you can use gates, but you have to use them as part of an overall system. Okay, Matt, before we start on segregation and mixed loading, did you want to go through some of those questions?
I believe that they were addressed. I believe that you covered them appropriately. It was mainly about the question of how that limit would apply to Packing Group 1 products, and the response there is that Packing Group 1 products will lower the amount that's permitted under the small loads threshold. We might provide a bit more detail about that in the report. It's probably easier to explain in text than in words on the fly.
Matt. Yeah, we'll include them in the FAQs that we publish after. And just a note, when we publish the FAQs after this webinar, it won't be a new set of FAQs. You may have noticed the ones that are already published have gaps in them, and that's because we've set it up to just continue to add as we go along. Okay, segregation and mixed loading. We heard comments about the need to carry forward the current exemption for fluorine, and also the need for rewording to incorporate both packages and tanks to make it clear. So the comments were mostly in relation to that reinstatement of the exemption, which is currently in AU 07 in the current code, and the comments about applying to all was to clarify that it wasn't just packaged dangerous goods. In response to those comments, we've made some amendments to the draft provisions in section 7.5.2. You can see those key changes highlighted here in yellow. The changes include the addition of a note to the start of 7.5.2.1 to replicate the current exemption for fluorine. We need to further amend this to make it regulatory text rather than a note. one thing we're considering is to create a handling and stowage special provision, so a CV code, and retaining the note as a reference to that CV code. 7.5.2.1 has also been redrafted to make it clear that segregation requirements apply to all dangerous goods, not just packages. You'll see there we've actually split it into two, one for packaged and one for segregation for tanks. The methods for segregation remain largely the same as they are in the current ADG code. Before we move to the table of specific chemicals that are incompatible, I'd like to show three options for how the mixed loading table is presented. We'd like you to consider these and provide feedback on which one you think is easy to read. You can think about that while we go through the next part of the webinar and add your preferred option in the chat. So please, we're going to show you three different options here, three different slides. So just try and make yourself a note of which one's which, so that you can think about them. Option one is essentially as it was presented in the consultation draft of the code. It's just had class 1 added in at the top and on the left-hand side. Option 2 shows non-compatible DG are identified with a no to say that they're not compatible, and blank cells indicate that the mixed loading is permitted, which will be clearly indicated in the code. The legend underneath will make it clear that what those two things mean. Option 3, this option reverses it. It identifies which dangerous goods are compatible, indicating these with a Y. In this case, the blank cells indicate that mixed loading is not permitted. Again, this will be clearly indicated in the code. So option 1 is as it currently is. Option 2 is where the incompatible are identified with a no. I'm going to just quickly show you that one again. And option 3 is where the ones that are compatible are shown with a Y. So if you can have a think about that while we just go through the next couple of slides, and if you can just add your preferred option into the chat, that would be great. Okay. Oh, people are going well already. Okay. We also received a couple of comments on the table of specific incompatibles, mainly regarding the omission of the word concentrated from the acids and alkalis combination. The comments confirmed our suspicion that this is not well understood and that in practice it's being applied in vastly different ways. The term concentrated is interpreted so differently by different people. The comments also identified that the proposed wording in the public draft may have wider implications than intended. To address this, we've narrowed the scope to PG1 and PG2 only. The table in the draft code is an updated version of the table in the current code. This table originally came from the IMDG code, the intent being to minimise intermodal barriers. In updating the table for the revised code, we revisited each of these in the current IMDG code and simply brought the provisions up to date with those provisions. A key problem with applying this table has always been knowing what UN numbers are captured by the chemical types in the table. For instance, how do you know which UN numbers are chlorides? Which ones are alkalis or strong acids? As you'll see on the next slide, the draft code borrows further from the IMDG code to help with this. Sorry, I'm going to just have a quick drink. Chapter 3.2 of the code now includes a new table, Table C, which includes groupings of dangerous goods that have similar chemical properties. The table on the left of this slide is a listing of all of the chemical groupings contained in that table of specific chemical incompatibilities. Table C lists the UN numbers for each of these chemical groupings. You can see I've just added a snapshot of acids here and a snapshot of alkalis. Within the listing for acids, each strong acid is identified with an asterisk. You can see the first one here, hydrogen fluoride anhydrous is an acid, and it's a strong acid. So we believe that this will help quite considerably with applying those incompatibilities in the specific for the specific chemicals. Okay, Matt.
Thanks, Deborah. Okay, so I'm going to whip through these last few slides fairly quickly because they're largely a repeat from webinar 1 again. Okay, so we're going to be scheduling drop-in webinars and providing progress updates after these webinars to close the loop on them. As mentioned, that the update for this webinar will probably be out early next week. That's our aim. Looking to the next steps for the code review, we're looking to hold the next webinar in about 3 weeks' time. We've got some other commitments and work over the next couple of weeks. So our next webinar is likely to be in 3 weeks while we do some work on class 1. We've got that tentatively scheduled in for Wednesday, the 2nd of April. We'll lock that in and we'll include a registration link in the progress update and on our website. Looking a little bit further down the line, Deborah's going to be on leave for a few weeks in April. And so I'll be taking that time to work through 2 topic-specific webinars. One of those will focus on tanks and vehicles, and the other one will look at gases and P200. So they'll be quite topic-specific and will be of interest to people who want to work through those particular issues rather than more general webinars. But again, we'll include some information on that in the progress update. Just to remind everybody about the timetable, as we've already stated, the timeline for the code review isn't fixed in stone, but we're working towards a mid-2025 date for having the code ready for approval. So it's not, the timeline isn't infinite, but we're taking the time to get it right. The code being in a state where it can be approved doesn't necessarily mean that it's ready to be published and put into use, but has all of the kinks ironed out. And so that allows us to give appropriate recommendations to ITSOC and ITM and allow them to come to a decision on the draft code. So no definitive dates at this time, but we will keep everybody informed about how this shapes up as the year progresses and we get a better sense of when decisions might be able to be made. So finally, just before we move into questions and answers, our contact details will be on the next slide. There's also a link and a QR code for a form that you can use to let us know about any issues related to the webinars and progress updates, or you can simply email us or call us. And as a reminder, again, we'll be sharing a copy of these slides. A recording of the webinar will be made available. And if we run out of time for questions today, we'll work on them in our update after the webinar. Just a reminder for everybody, as we take questions, we'll give you access to a microphone and camera, and then you need to turn on your camera and microphone. Just a reminder that when you're not speaking, if you can just keep your microphone muted, just in case we have any issues with feedback or background noise, because sometimes Teams does that to us. So again, thanks everybody, and we'll move into questions and answers.
Okay, Matt, we've got a tie between option 1 and option 3 for segregation. Nobody likes option 2, which is the end, so we can dismiss that. We'll look further into option 1 and option 3. I would like to, we have mixed views. The reason for drafting option 1 originally in the draft code with the Y's and the N's was from my experience with a logistics company. I originally prepared this for them, and they wanted every square done because of what did a blank mean. There are other views that it is too fussy. and too hard to read. So we may, in the FAQs, when we publish this webinar, the recording, we're going to add that again in there and try and get a broader view, because I think we've had about 10, maybe 12 responses here. So we'll try and canvass that a bit further.
Yeah, if I could, if I
Okay.
can maybe touch on something else that we heard that maybe didn't get addressed, was we did hear some questions about, or some questions about whether we could differentiate them by color or some other means. Because of things like accessibility requirements and those sorts of things, it's not necessarily straightforward for us to do that in the code itself. There's nothing stopping segregation charts or segregation information being provided like that outside of the code. So that might be an option, but that does that sort of method of differentiating between them, between the Ys and Ns, is a little bit more difficult to achieve in the body of the code itself.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions here that I will just address first, because they're, again, to do with segregation, mostly with Class 8. The first question is, how do you apply it to a subsidiary residence Class 8? When you are looking at incompatibilities, you must consider every risk that dangerous goods presents. If it is a 3 with a Class 8 or with a subsidiary hazard of 8, you need to assess it as Class 3, and then you will need to assess it for its Class 8. So you have to consider every hazard that it presents. The other comment was, do you look at the concentration on the SDS and what the product is? Well, you don't need, no, concentration is no longer included in it, so you don't need to even consider the concentration. What you need to look at is it a PG1, PG2 or PG3? And that certainly will be on the SDS. Another couple of just quick comments here. One is, if a blank square means they're incompatible, isn't it easy to simply insert an N? That makes the table quite clear. And another one is, all squares could lead to error. Option 3 is clear, full is compatible. So again, we are getting these mixed views. So we'll canvas as wide as we can.